Good morning, students, and welcome to this morning's contact-based session specifically aimed at the exam for 2018. This is Educational Foundations 1 for DPP, DJP, and BES, and I'm Ms. Isabeau Besaidenout. First of all, I'd like us to have a look at an introduction to this specific module. This module will enable you to develop theoretical understanding, values, and competencies as the foundation of your education in becoming an educator. It also aims to help you understand the role that history of education, comparative education, international development, colonial education, reforms, and policies played in transforming education. It is compiled of different chapters that will explain the importance and the contribution of different perspectives, systems, and factors that shape the Namibian educational system. Although the chapters address different issues, these issues are not necessarily separated in the classroom reality. In other words, it means that you should integrate the knowledge of the different chapters to achieve a holistic view on teaching practices. Let's start with Unit 1, which deals with the history of education and comparative education as disciplines. We study different educational systems and the history of those systems and compare them with one another. So that is why we refer to comparative education. When we study and we say we are looking at comparative education, we cannot study this discipline without including the history of education. Now, why is it important to look at the history of education? First of all, to inform prospective teachers about broad educational and social policy, and it can also help uncover frames of reference, guiding principle, and other theoretical aspects which routine questions always raise. Furthermore, it provides the knowledge necessary for background, understanding, and action in education. It also gives an opportunity for students and teachers to learn to choose intelligent and courageous actions among ambiguous, often agonizing alternatives to the practice of teaching in the class. The study of history of education can also be significant if it causes the student as well as the teacher to consider the human condition, to order, interpret, and seek meaning in educational affairs. Another statement that one could consider is that when we study history, it will help us to become better citizens. Now, why do we say so? It's one of the most common justifications for the place of history in our school curricula, and advocates of this kind of education hope to promote national identity and loyalty through a history spiced with vivid stories and lessons in individual success and morality. But we must consider that history is far more than that the history for citizenship goes beyond this narrow goal, and it can even challenge it at some points. We say this because history can lay the foundation for genuine citizenship in one sense to the essential uses of a study of the past. It also provides data about the emergence of national institutions, problems, and values. It can offer us evidence also about how nations have interacted with other societies, providing international and comparative perspectives which are essential for responsible citizenship. Furthermore, by studying history, it helps us to understand how our recent, current, and prospective changes affect the lives of our citizens and are emerging or may emerge, and what causes are involved. More importantly even, is that studying history encourages habits of the mind that are vital for responsible public behavior, whether as a national or community leader, an informed voter, a petitioner, or simply as observers. History also provides a terrain for moral contemplation. In other words, it gives us a lot to think about, especially when we consider our own morals and our own moral behavior. When we study the story of individuals and situations in the past, it allows us to test our own moral sense and to hone it against some of the real complexities individuals have faced in difficult settings. When we look at people who have weathered adversity in real life, it can provide us with inspiration. History teaching by example is a phrase that describes the use of the study of the past. So this is a study not only of certifiable heroes, but of more ordinary people who provide us with lessons in courage, diligence, or constructive protest. History also helps provide identity, and this is unquestionably one of the reasons that all modern nations encourage its teaching in some form. Historical data includes evidence about how families, groups, institutions, and whole countries were formed, and also how they have evolved while retaining cohesion. For many Americans, studying the history of one's own family is the most obvious use of history because it provides you information about genealogy and a basis for understanding how the family has interacted with larger historical change. Thus, family identity is established and confirmed. Also, we see that many institutions, businesses, communities, and social units, such as ethnic groups in the United States, use history for similar identity purposes. That brings us to the end of the study of education and also considering the history of education. The next important issue in this unit is that of homeschooling. And we particularly want to have a look at what issues you need to consider before you should consider taking your child into a homeschooling environment. The first is socialization. It's one of the most debated issues on homeschooling, and I think the most important question to ask there is, does the child develop the skills to socialize if he or she is homeschooled? The second problematic issue is curriculum. What curriculum should you use? There are so many different curriculums, programs, and methods to choose from, a parent may become completely confused or scared of homeschooling the child. Most countries have a specific curriculum that the child must follow, so even when homeschooled, they have to follow that specific curriculum. In the third place, the parent has to consider over and under scheduling. You still need to follow a schedule or a timetable, even if you do it at home. Some parents try to do too much in a day, while others might do too little. Then there's the issue of unrealistic expectations. Some parents expect too much of their children. It's very important for a parent to know their child's abilities and what they struggle with. In the fifth place, we consider the disorganized schoolroom. Though the child will be taught at home, it still needs to be an organized environment. Everything must have a place, because to start looking for something before you teach will only waste time and energy. Everything that is needed for the day, therefore, should be available before the teaching begins. Then we come to the challenges in improving the management of delivery systems for quality of and access to pre-primary programs. And we're going to look at three specific challenges. The first challenge in improving the management and delivery of pre-primary education is to establish a new policy and institutional framework within the Ministry of Education to manage pre-primary education effectively. Now that's a mouthful, so you will need to break this statement up and make sure that you really understand what it means. Pertaining to this, it has an ultimate goal for 2030 that there will be an establishment of a pre-primary year in all primary schools for every child aged 5 to 6 years of age to be developed in serving specifically the poorest populations and OVCs. The second one is the needs of the existing system that must be reviewed, and there must be a coherent capacity development program that should be developed and implemented to improve the quality of education in existing schools. So here we are focusing on developing a program that will implement quality teaching. This should be implemented to allow children reaching grade 1 with little or no prior early childhood development experience, and it must also accommodate children living in difficult circumstances. This pre-primary program is based on an expanded vision of the existing school readiness curriculum, and it should be developed together with an emergency training package. Norms and standards should be developed against which the performance of existing institutions and teachers can be evaluated and improved. It should also use EMIS and tracking systems to measure the progress of the most vulnerable children. In the third place, we must consider the capacity to deliver pre-primary, and this has to be increased. Firstly, through tapping the existing pool of ECD staff through recruitment, and also through in-service training to meet the required standards, as well as through appropriate remuneration, and subsequently through attracting new recruits from vocational and teacher training and the establishment of a pre-primary career structure. In addition, infrastructure support will be necessary to provide curriculum revision and material development as the system progresses. There should be a parallel program of classroom construction that is developed as money becomes available. This brings us to Unit 2, which is titled The Contribution of Selected Historical Figures. Now I'm going to focus on certain aspects of 4 historical figures that played a role in the development of our education system. And first of all, I want to look at the contributions of Jomo Kenyatta, especially those that he made to the African education. And we look at a bit of his background as well. Following Kenya's independence in 1963, Jomo Kenyatta became the first Prime Minister and later the first President of Kenya. He adopted the notion of Harambee, which is a concept of pulling the country together to build a new nation. He also encouraged communities to work together to raise funds for all sorts of local projects, pledging that the government would provide the startup costs. He was known, or is still known, as the father of the nation, and that says a lot as to how Kenyans view Kenyatta and his character. He was definitely a renowned leader who had vision, initiative, guidance, and he was also an international public figure. He gave Kenyans hope and a true belief in the future of their country. He also instilled in them a desire for freedom and independence. He was a capable scholar, journalist, teacher, biographer, conservationist, and also, as we said, a father figure that Kenya needed at the time. His spirit still lives on today in Kenya and is still very much loved and remembered. His beliefs are still an inspiration. He loved his country and he would be proud that it is still an independent nation. Travelers from the West still venture into Kenya, but they are greeted by a proud people who show them their culture and heritage, not a people cowering in the darkness. Now we want to look at Vittorino del Feltre. He was one of the earliest and most influential educators in the humanist tradition that developed and flourished in Renaissance Italy. And I specifically want to focus on 3 of the subjects that he believed were very important to teach. The first one was logic, and he saw it as an aid to thinking rather than a mathematical concept. He also believed it was a useful aid to composition and instruction, and a practical tool to be used in inquiring after the truth. Still, it would always remain secondary to grammar and letters. That is now according to de Veltre. Then he also believed in the importance of history. He believed that it should be taught not so much for its political as for its moral value. The last subject that he emphasized was philosophy, not as a contemplative subject, but as a guide to proper conduct in life. He saw it as the culmination of learning, and ethics taught men and women to be good citizens in the world. Our next figure is William Spady. And there's a lot in your module about William Spady, but I just want us to look at what his early thinking about schooling was. He believed that all students can learn and succeed, but not on the same day in the same way. He also believed that successful learning promotes even more successful learning, and that schools control many of the conditions that directly affect successful school learning. What and whether students learn is more important than when and how they learn. The purpose of the school is to equip students for their lives after school. Also, that students learn best when they have a clear picture of what is expected of them and when they are given adequate time to accomplish these things. In-depth learning of significant things is more useful than superficial learning about things of little consequence. And I think if we consider all of these beliefs that he had, we can find it very relevant to our teaching today in our Namibian classrooms. The next part of this unit that I would like you to take note of is there are a lot of concepts that you need to understand that are used in this module, and I want you to focus on it in the sense that you are able to shortly define it, and the type of questions you can expect will mostly just be the asking of a short definition, or perhaps to mix and match the term with its definition. So I'm going to shortly go through some of the concepts. First of all, we look at empiricism. Now, this is a theory of knowledge that asserts that knowledge comes only or primarily from sensory experience. It's one of the several views of epistemology, and it emphasizes the role of experience and evidence, especially sensory perception, in the formation of ideas over the notion of innate ideas or traditions. The next concept is humanism. In philosophy and social science, humanism refers to a perspective that affirms some notion of a human nature. The word itself comes from the Italian term humanista, which describes a teacher or scholar of classical Greek and Latin literature and the ethical philosophy behind it. Our next term is socialism, and socialism refers to an economic system that is characterized by social ownership and cooperative management of the means of production, and a political philosophy advocating such a system. Next, we look at naturalism. This commonly refers to the viewpoint that laws of nature operate in the universe and that nothing exists beyond the natural universe, or if it does not affect the natural universe. Functionalism is a framework for building theory that sees society as a complex system whose parts work together to promote solidarity and stability. Then if we look at Marxism, one of the beliefs in Marxism is that as an ideology, it encompasses an economic theory, a sociological theory, and a revolutionary view of social change. The last one on this slide is aesthetics, which is a branch of philosophy dealing with the nature of beauty, art, and taste, with the creation and appreciation of beauty. Behaviorism, our next term, refers to all things that organisms do are best treated by altering behavior patterns or modifying the environment. Contextualism emphasizes the context in which an action, utterance, or expression occurs, while instrumentalism refers to the truth as an instrument used by human beings to solve their problems. Then our last one on this slide is called elitism, and this is when a select group of people with certain distinctive attributes are those whose views on a matter are to be taken the most seriously or to carry the most weight. That brings us to the last of the terms in Unit 2 that you should please familiarize yourself with and read a bit more on each of them in your study guide. Unit 3 is titled International Historical Development of Pre-Primary Education. So let's just have a look at the beginnings of early childhood education. Now, early childhood education, the care and instruction of young children outside the home, has become a downward extension of schooling over the last half century. It was only after World War II that early childhood education came to be seen as an important first step on the educational ladder. Now, there was a movement in America, it was called the Head Start program, that was launched in 1960 or in the 1960s, and it was for the low-income children, but it had an unintended consequence. It was very effective, but because of the title, parents got the impression that education was a race because of the word Head Start. So they believed that the earlier you start then with education, the earlier and better you would finish. So that led to middle-income parents also wanting their preschoolers to have a head start as well. And it gave added emphasis to the importance of early childhood education as the answer to improving the educational system. The next aspect that's very important in this module is we need to look at the 4 basic areas that cover and explain the rights and the responsibilities of us as teachers. Now, the following 4 areas are very valuable. First of all, professional freedom. Secondly, the responsibility of teachers and the education service as a whole. Then the relations between all the parties. And in the fourth place, the rights of teachers. So let's have a look at the responsibilities of teachers according to UNESCO's recommendations concerning the status of teachers. Recognizing that the status of our profession depends to a considerable extent upon ourselves, all of us as teachers should seek to achieve the highest possible standard in all the professional work that we do. Furthermore, professional standards relating to teacher performance should be defined and maintained with the participation of teachers' organizations. Teachers as well as teaching organizations should seek to cooperate fully with authorities in the interest of the learners, of the education service and society in general. There should be a code of ethics or of conduct that is established by the teachers' organizations, since such codes greatly contribute to ensuring the prestige of the profession and the exercise of professional duties in accordance with agreed principles. Teachers should be prepared to take part in extracurricular activities for the benefit of both learners and adults. Next, I want us to focus on the 4 core principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They are non-discrimination, devotion to the best interest of the child, the right to life, survival and development, and respect for the views of the child. These 4 principles are very, very important. And we will see that when we look at Chapter 4, Article 28 of the Human Rights Act, a lot of these principles will be seen. Now, this specific article emphasizes the recognition of the right of the child to education, and with a view to achieving this right progressively on the basis of equal opportunity. What particularly should be done is the following. Primary education should be compulsory and available free to all. Higher education should be accessible to all on the basis of capacity by every appropriate means. Also, educational and vocational information and guidance should be available and accessible to all children. And then lastly, measures should be taken to encourage regular attendance at school and to reduce dropout rates. Legislation in this module that I want you to go and look at in a little bit more detail. You do not need to memorize each and everything, but you need to take note of all of these that affect the rights of children, or the Child Soldiers Protocol, the Convention of Children's Rights, the Minimum Age Convention, and also the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child. I would like you to read through these documents, taking note, and as you read them, just think a bit about the relevance with regard to educators and learners in Namibia. So you won't be expected to answer essay questions on these, but I think it's important that you do take note of each of these documents. Now let's go and look at the importance of professional freedom for educators. The teaching profession should enjoy academic freedom in the discharge of professional duties. Since teachers are particularly qualified to judge the teaching aids and the methods most suitable for their learners, they should be given the essential role in the choice and the adaptation of teaching materials, the selection of textbooks, and the application of teaching methods within the framework of approved programs and with the assistance of the educational authorities. Teachers and their organizations should also participate in the development of new courses, textbooks, and teaching aids. Any systems of inspection or supervision should be designed to encourage and to help teachers in the performance of their professional tasks, and should be such as not to diminish the freedom, initiative, and responsibility of teachers. Where any kind of direct assessment of the teacher's work is required, such assessment should be objective and should be made known to the teachers. It's important to note that teachers should have a right to appeal against assessments which they deem to be unjustified. Furthermore, teachers should be free to make use of such evaluation techniques as they may deem useful for the appraisal of learners' progress, but should ensure that no unfairness to individual learners result. And in the last place, the authority should give due weight to the recommendations of teachers regarding the suitability of individual learners for courses and further education of different kinds. So clearly, we can see that with teachers' rights, there also comes a lot of responsibilities that go hand in hand with these rights. This brings us to Unit 4, which deals with the features and effects of colonial education on the Namibian people. And the first aspect I'd like us to look at is the religious education of the colonial era that was later utilized by the Germans. Now, indigenous people were provided in colonial times with well-calculated limited skills to ensure that they would remain manual workers, as this provided cheap labor to the whites. Reserves were also created for the indigenous people, and the German colonial government paid no attention to the establishment of adequate schools for them there. When we look at the history of German colonialism, it becomes clear that the Germans were not much interested in educating the natives, but rather in trading and making money. Education was used as an instrument to oppress during the colonial and apartheid rule in Namibia. During Germany's colonial rule, schools were built only for the white people, and history has it that the Germans in fact never came to grips with the objectives of education for the Africans, even in the rare cases of trickle-down education. The German administration did, however, ensure that the kind of training made available served the needs of the masters of the country, a source of servants and laborers. For African education was designed to keep them inferior and to avoid inculcating such mischievous and intolerable ideas as democracy, human freedom, and the like. In 1909, the German authorities introduced organized education for the white population, but little changed for the indigenous people, who were not yet seen as being necessary for the country's economic development, so they were not provided with any education. Like the German authorities, the missionaries didn't want to risk giving the indigenous population an education that might result in them wanting democracy and equality. However, in order to establish Christian communities, the African people at least had to be taught to read and write. Primary schools were founded in small scattered communities around the country from the late 19th century and onwards. Now, in this sense, how did they control the indigenous people with the colonial education? So we look at the title of this next slide, which says control and cooperation were other aspects of the colonial education. In the Namibian context, Bantu education served to enforce class domination and racial repression. This education sought to create a culture of silence that protected the political interests of the ruling minority. The colonial subjects were expected to reject their history and traditions, and as such some at least became ambivalent about their traditional past, while others developed a self-image of incompetence. Another very important aspect, or something that one could debate about or write a critical essay about your thoughts on the topic, is that the advent of Christian mission changed the cultural imagination of the Africans fundamentally. Now let's look at in which sense we can make this statement. Historical and anthropological studies show that the advent of the Christian mission changed the cultural imagination of the Africans. The efforts of the Christian missionaries were decisive in the imposition of a new mode of being. The reconstruction of religion, aesthetics, knowledge, bodily representation, sexuality, gender relations, and social institutions such as marriage and the family, and indeed most aspects of people's living. Thus, the cultural implication of Christian missions caused a cardinal reconstruction of identity and the social space. Examples that we can use here as well is that most missionary societies were fervently opposed to the traditional lifestyles, and they refer to it as pagan customs. The Lutheran missionary societies were very strict especially, while the Anglican and Roman Catholic churches were more permissive. They allowed indigenous customs and cultural expressions such as the ifundula, the traditional wedding in Ovambuland, but they also did very little to contribute and preserve the survival of these customs. Particularly Carl Hugo Hahn from the Rhenish Missionary Society tried later to establish a politically and economically autonomous mission colony in Ochimbingwe by mission through colonization. That's then the end of Unit 4. Unit 5, our second last unit, deals with the major reform in pre-primary education after independence. And then, of course, we have to focus on what we all are familiar with, the Education and Training Sector Improvement Plan. And I'm going to give you an outline of the most important factors or most important aims that is considered by ETSIP. First of all, to improve the quality of general education from grade 1 to 12. In the second place, improving access to ICTs to enhance learning and administration. In the third place, improving efficiency and reducing wastage throughout the education system. Also to expand the provision of senior secondary education and reforming and expanding vocational education and training. Furthermore, to strengthen tertiary education and training, to develop a national system of knowledge management and innovation, to enhance early childhood development and pre-primary education, to strengthen access to information, culture and lifelong learning, to enhance HIV/AIDS management education, and promote equity in education. In the last place, to pursue a capacity development program to improve all aspects of institutional development. Now let's have a look at Article 20 of the Namibia's Constitution, what it says with regard to education for all, because I think education for all is a phrase that we are confronted with a lot nowadays. Let's have a look and see exactly what this entails or what it entitles. Basic education shall be free and compulsory, and all persons shall have a right to education. Primary education shall be compulsory, and the state shall provide reasonable facilities to render effective this right for every resident within Namibia. By establishing and maintaining state schools at which primary education will be provided free of charge. Children shall not be allowed to leave school until they have completed their primary education, or they have attained the age of 16 years, whichever is the sooner, save insofar as this may be authorized by Act of Parliament on grounds of health or other considerations pertaining to the public interest. Now we go over to a whole new topic, and this topic is very interesting and also very relevant, and it deals with what role English across the curriculum has in preparing learners for a knowledge-based society, as well as providing them with learning experiences which motivate them to learn more. We know that English has a special role in the Namibian situation because it's our official language as well as our medium of instruction from grade 4 upwards. Therefore, every teacher has the responsibility to improve learners' oral, that means listening, as well as their oral skills, their speaking skills, in discussion, reflection and reporting, as well as their perceptual skills in using different types of reading techniques and materials. We also need to improve learners' writing skills in summaries, note-taking, writing papers and reports. Teachers must be very aware of where the learners have limited English language skills, and they have to provide opportunities for learners to exercise them. English teachers must be kept informed of what particular needs learners may have for the reinforcement in English. Furthermore, all teachers must develop the learners' core skills of communication. This entails to develop their familiarity with and the ease in using the terminology of the subject and its discourse. In other words, the way of talking about the subject matter. Since English is a second language for the majority of our learners, subject teachers must take time to ensure that learners understand the vocabulary, the technical terms and the jargon of the subject. It mustn't be an abstract term to them that they just learn by rote, in other words, just memorize without understanding it, but they must be able to use the terms correctly and meaningfully in context. Attention must be given to explaining what technical terms mean as they arise and to develop oral and written communication within and about the subject matter, processes and skills. The next topic is the global education reform movement. Now, I also need you to go to the unit that we are busy with, to also go and do a bit of reading on your own and not to solely just depend and concentrate on the PowerPoint presentation, though it is a very strong guideline to how you should prepare for the examination. So when we look at this next topic, it's explained very briefly, but I need you to be able to answer the questions that follow after the introduction to the topic. Now, the global education reform movement deals with the following 6 aspects. The first inspiration in this movement is the new paradigm of learning that became dominant in the 1980s. The second inspiration is the public demand to guarantee effective learning for all learners. And the third inspiration that it deals with is the accountability movement in education that has accompanied the global wave of decentralization of public services. Now, after you've considered this movement, I need you to go and look at Unit 5 again and see how you would answer the following questions. Why is quality education for all far from fulfilled in Namibia? See if you can write about 3 to 5 sentences only. What is an Education Act? In other words, give me a definition of that. What was the primary objective of the Education Act number 16, which was promulgated in December 2001? And also, that was the last question. I thought there was another. So those 3 questions are important to have a look at. This brings us to our very last unit in the module, titled Factors and Foundations that Influence Our Educational Systems. And I'm first of all again going to look at some terms that you need to be familiar with. And the first one is, what do we mean if we say a child has or a learner has a barrier to learning? Barriers to learning can be within a learner, within the center of learning, within the education system, and within the broader social, economic, and political context. So a lot of factors play a role in leading to a barrier to learning. The barriers may manifest in different ways and only become obvious when learning breakdown occurs. And that's usually when the learner drops out of the system or when the excluded becomes visible. Sometimes it is possible to identify permanent barriers, though, in the learner or the system, which can be addressed through enabling mechanisms and processes. So with permanent barriers, we mean a barrier that's generally there and might hamper a learner from being successful in education. The next term or the next concept that I want you to look at is educational psychology. What do we mean by this term? It is the study of how humans learn in educational settings, the effectiveness of educational interventions, the psychology of teaching, and the social psychology of schools as organization. It's concerned with how students learn and develop, often focusing on subgroups such as gifted children and those subjects to specific disabilities. Then we have 2 concepts that I would like you to be able to differentiate. In other words, if I ask you to differentiate, I want you to tell me how are they different from one another. So we're focusing on the differences by considering the facts that are presented in the guide. We look at an explanation for inclusive education, and it is built on the child's right to participate and the school's duty to accept the child. It rejects the use of special schools or classroom to separate students with disabilities from students without disabilities. A premium here is placed upon full participation by students with disabilities and upon respect for their social, civil, and educational rights. It also gives students with disabilities skills that they can use inside and outside the classroom. Fully inclusive schools, especially here in Namibia, are rare, and they no longer distinguish between general education and special education programs. Instead, the school is restructured so that we accommodate all students and they learn together. Now we go over to the next topic, which deals with the role education reform plays in promoting economic competitiveness in Namibia. Typically, education reform that is targeted on serving a knowledge-based economy emphasizes mathematics and science, information and communication technologies, basic knowledge and skills in literacy, and development of interpersonal skills. A successful knowledge-based economy also requires advanced secondary and tertiary education provision, able to boost labor productivity, research, as well as innovation. Many of the education reforms aimed at promoting economic competitiveness in the knowledge economies take the form of centrally steered structural and programmatic directives. Only rarely are these changes directly related to what teachers and learners are doing in schools and classrooms. Successful economies compete on the basis of high value, not on only low cost. And how is this guaranteed? This is best guaranteed by well-trained and educated personnel and flexible lifelong learning opportunities for all citizens. The most frequently presented general idea for increasing economic competitiveness is to equip people with the skills and attitudes for economic and civic success in an increasingly knowledge-based economy. This is rhetoric typically written into the strategies or policies that address the relation between economic competitiveness and development of education. In the midst of global education reforms, it is difficult to answer the question that many teachers ask: what should we do differently in schools in order to contribute effectively to economic competitiveness and growth? Before we explore this question further, we need to examine what economic competitiveness means so that we can understand better what schools should do differently. Here, governments have an essential role to play by offering and guaranteeing a good education that adequately emphasizes the core determinants of economic competitiveness. However, it has been difficult to translate this central role of education into concrete actions and programs that lead to improved human capital and therefore contribute to the social and economic progress. So we can see this is quite a difficult and problematic topic that really has to be studied in great detail. We now go over to another factor that we need to consider as teachers. In our classrooms every day, we might be dealing with children that have been victims of war, poverty, overcrowded housing, inadequate food supply, polluted water, lack of sanitary facilities and isolation, just depending on which schools we are teaching and what the specific environment is that these children have been growing up or the things that they've been exposed to. So let's look at the main influence this situation has on the educational system as well as the effect it has on curriculum revision. The formal school curricula are being revised to strengthen cross-curricular themes, specifically HIV, AIDS and health education, human rights and democracy, environmental education, information communication technologies, entrepreneurial skill development, and other emerging issues, and to eliminate obsolete content and practices. This means content and practices that no longer serve a purpose should be eliminated from the curricula. The acquisition of literacy, numeracy, and life skills is emphasized at lower primary level, and the curriculum has been streamlined to reflect that emphasis. At senior secondary level, the emphasis is on the localization of the Cc curriculum, or the higher and the lower curriculum, in order to ensure more relevance and local application. The teacher education curricula offered by the Colleges of Education and the University of Namibia will be revised once the revision for the formal school system has been done. And by doing this, it will ensure that teacher education curricula will be aligned and responsive to the needs and requirements of the school curricula. That then brings us to the end of the content that you should focus on most for the coming examination. But I would also like us to look at some general guidelines or some points that you should really consider when you prepare for your examinations. First of all, I want to focus on action verbs. Many students still are not very sure on what these action verbs are or how they should consider each of them. And the reason why they are important is because it has to do with which thinking process is going to be involved when answering the question. There's a table of verbs in section 7 in the beginning of your guide, and it will explain to you what kind of thinking is involved, and that's how you should answer the questions that are asked. So please consider that you know what each of these mean. For example, if I take action verbs like analyze, examine, and evaluate, those are not level 1 action verbs. In other words, it's a kind of verb that asks a bit of your own input. Thus, you will have to give me an opinion or a judgment, and I will expect you to draw a certain conclusion. Then, very importantly, when you study, please make sure that you understand what you are learning. Use a dictionary for unfamiliar words, because this specific module has a lot of difficult words. It has a lot of terminology that is challenging, so you need to put in a bit more. You need to prepare well in advance so that you understand what you are learning, because you cannot memorize things that make no sense to you. Then when you answer, this is more pertaining to assignments, but I think when you prepare yourself as well, try to use your own words but not to change the meaning. And then very important for the examination also is write full grammatically correct sentences. Don't just write down phrases or bullet points. Answer properly and make sure that your marker will understand what you have written. Now, my advice that I want to leave you with, if you look at this PowerPoint presentation, you will see that I took out some of the most important parts in each module. You need to go and read through this and make sense of it, your own sense. And I would advise you to highlight the main points, the most important points or keywords that you find in each of these topics. Then really see, do you understand what you have looked at? Are you able to rewrite it meaningfully? And that can only be done if you understand all the words that are used. Start well in advance. It is a challenging module, and also by starting well in advance, you will be able to contact me, not right before the exam, but maybe a week at least, that I can advise you, that I can direct you and guide you if you have any aspects that are giving you a problem. I want to give you my contact details. As I said, I'm Ms. Besaidenout. You are very welcome to phone me, or preferably to SMS me on 081 251 2987. The reason I ask you to send me an SMS is it allows me to phone you back when I'm ready to address your question, and then we can also agree on a time that suits the both of us. Then of course you can also email me if you have email facilities, and I can answer you in a bit more detail, and maybe it can also be a bit more meaningful if I can put these points in writing instead of only explaining to you via the telephone. I want to leave you with the words that you are definitely able to be successful. You can definitely pass this module, but you need to put in a lot of work and you need to start well in advance. Thank you for your attention, and the best of luck for this module.